What do you think the Chinese are thinking right now in the context of the war in Ukraine, but also what's happened in Venezuela? Never want to underestimate what the CCP is capable of or thinking, but I'm curious how you see that.
Well, the Chinese relationship with Russia has always been highly transactional. They don't see the Russian Federation as in the least bit comparable to what they have in China, and I think that's an accurate assessment. That said, they don't want Russia to lose the war. I believe President Xi has said that explicitly publicly. And they are the biggest enabler of the military-industrial complex of Russia. They're the ones providing the wherewithal. Remember, in the early days of the war, the full-blown war, Russia was buying huge numbers of refrigerators and then stripping them for their chips and other elements that were useful in the Russian military industrial complex. China is now providing all of that.
This is the Global Gambit.
I guess my perspective is, again, because of the unpredictability of Trump, of the volatility, his approach to international relations, great power competition, all this sort of matter. Isn't it not a case of you needing to de-risk? We've seen the British and French discuss the idea of taking over the nuclear umbrella, the idea of producing peacekeepers in the event of a ceasefire. Is that something that still needs to be done for Europe's own sake, or it's just impossible given the
No, the
US's?
de-risking component should be to spend more on defense, and Europe is actually doing that. The de-risking component is to establish a coalition of the willing, led by European countries, in this case, the UK and France. The de-risking component is to do more with the European Commission to support Ukraine. All of these are ongoing. They've probably received an additional catalytic effect from some of President Trump's actions and rhetoric. But frankly, you also ought to give him credit, certainly along with Vladimir Putin, for contributing to the increase of defense spending by European countries.
Sure. I mean,
I watched four American presidents during my time in it's just the post-Cold War era, railing about European uh, defense spending that was inadequate, and none of them made any progress.
no,
President Trump 2.0 has done just that.
I certainly, and for, some people raising eyebrows for us complimenting Trump, but I agree with you. I think that the one thing that has been important is that he has given them a wake-up call. But my problem is the lack of follow-through. When we have governments acknowledging what has happened in Venezuela, but then the British produce a helicopter and a naval vessel to support the American seizure of the tanker, right? It's a little bit awkward for me that the British are unwilling to call out the double standards of the Trump administration, but then also support them. It's for me, there's an issue in Europe in that we need to either stick to the principles that we're preaching or not try to preach them. And do you not think that's a bit of a problem?
As the villainous prime minister in the original House of Cards loved to say, you might say that I couldn't possibly comment. Beyond that, actually, I would challenge the assertion that there's any similarity between the Russian Federation launching a full scale offensive to deny its neighbor Ukraine its very right to exist an autonomous sovereign country, and a special operations raid to bring the president of Venezuela and his wife to justice in the United States.
But okay, this is interesting. But do you not think the basis by which that from a purely military standpoint, Operation Absolute Resolve was amazing. No denial that no other country could conduct what the US did, but is it still not based on quite questionable pretenses?
You can argue the legality of what has been done, and there are plenty of international legal experts that are arguing on both sides, by the way. I don't
Hmm.
think there's a shred of argument for the legality of what President Putin has done to Ukraine.
No, certainly not. But then, okay, when it comes to now what we're seeing with the shadow fleet, this growing assertion by the United States to seize these covert assets, what do you think this does for the, well, classic fog of war, the gray zone in warfare? Are we seeing more and more ambiguity around it, or has Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine reminded us that more conventional kinetic warfare is still?
I think there's plenty of Russian actions, vastly more Russian actions of gray zone warfare than what we have seen by President Trump in the United States in terms of denying the operations of the Shadow Fleet, of course, one of which was Russian flagged, which did not deter the United States from taking control of that vessel either.
So do you think, therefore, this plays into Ukraine's benefit longer term? The 105 billion, Trump's growing pressure on Russia and China by extension. What do you think this does for the front line over the next, say, half a year?
Well, that doesn't affect the front lines. That affects Russia's ability to continue to prosecute this war.
Mm.
And there are other factors, of course, as well, one of which is the question of how long can Putin continue to recruit soldiers for a war that is just creating staggering casualties, which are coming home quite visibly. And yes, the recruitment bonuses are extraordinary. And yes, the death payments are extraordinary, but there's also a question already of whether or not Russia can continue to afford those, particularly once it runs out of its national welfare fund, and if there can be pressure on countries not to buy gas and oil above the approved price, and also pressure on those who are providing the enormous numbers of components, the materiel for the Russian war machine to continue to produce weapon systems, munitions, communications systems, and so forth.
So on the one hand, we've had this action by the US over the tankers, and Trump seems to be much more combative now with the Kremlin. I think a large proportion of that has to do with this false flag that the Kremlin attempted to claim about Ukraine's striking of Putin's residency right last month.
Oh, I
Uh,
think it's also frustration with Russia. Again,
oh,
Trump has tried everything. He literally rolled out the red carpet for Putin in Alaska. And how did Putin respond? The largest number of air and missile and so forth attacks that had ever been. He's responded similarly when the U.S. has reached out on other occasions. And most recently, there has been outright rejection of anything other than Russia achieving its core objectives, which are unacceptable to Ukraine and should be unacceptable to us. Essentially, they would consist of replacing President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure, giving Russia territory in the Donetsk, Luhansk area, the Donbass, that Russia hasn't even approached yet. And despite trying for years now, and which include the so-called fortified cities of Ukraine, with which control gives you a straight shot at Kyiv. And then, of course, the demilitarization of Ukraine to the extent that they can possibly achieve that. Again, none of those can be acceptable to Kyiv nor the Ukrainian citizens. And the decision to give up territory is not one that President Zelensky can take without a referendum of the people and their approval. So Russia has been really antagonizing Trump now by their unwillingness to even contemplate, even undertake somewhat serious negotiations, in contrast to Ukraine, which has been doing just that.
well, certainly, I don't think it should go past anyone that the Kremlin never genuinely engages in sincere intent But it sounds to me like you have quite a favorable view of Trump's position or shifting. Do you think that he's actually going to support Ukraine more explicitly, or is it more that he just wants to hurt Putin? Because there's a difference there to me.
I think it's hard to say. Some of my uh, statements have been a bit aspirational. In particular, I hope that Senator Lindsey Graham, who I know very, very well, he was one of the three amigos, McCain, Lieberman, and Graham, who were the ones supporting the surge most strongly in the Senate at the dicier moments of that particular endeavor. And actually served under me on a number of occasions. He was a colonel in the U.S. Air Force, a judge advocate general officer who did something like 14 or 15 small week-long tours on active duty when I was the commander in Iraq Central Command in Afghanistan. He has said that the White House has greenlit the sanctions. These are very draconian sanctions that have been approved by, I think it's as much now as 90 of 100 senators and strong support in the House of Representatives as well. If that is actually implemented, that would be very substantial and it would admirably complement the sanctions that the EU has put on Russia.
It would. How much do you think this plays into the mindset that Trump has, though? What do you think his mindset is? Because to me, it's a case of sort of spheres of influence, appreciation for realpolitik. What was great power competition, I think, is more just great power politics now. And that's why I remain cautious in being overly confident about Trump's support because he seems to have this favoritism for strongmen, Xi Jinping, Putin, Netanyahu. Would you agree with that assessment, or it's too crude?
Oh, I think you should be cautious. I'm not sure I buy the whole spheres of influence thing. We're active around the world. Look at what is being threatened in Iran right now and under discussion by the National Security Council of the United States, laying out for Trump today all of the options available, which include much more than military. There's humanitarian, diplomatic, informational, economic, and so forth, as well as military options. But those will be the ones on which folks focus most significantly. But I just don't buy the idea that we're saying, hey, China, you can have this, and Russia, you can have that. I don't see that sign. Certainly, we are going to have an updated version of the Monroe Doctrine or whatever for the Western Hemisphere. By the way, that's a bit belated because China is very, very active in Latin America. Iran has been very active in Latin America, and Russia has been active when it comes to Venezuela and Cuba in particular. By the way, I'd just note that the much vaunted air and ballistic missile defense systems, of which President Maduro was very pleased and proud, the Russian and Chinese systems were knocked out very early on by the U.S. Actions supporting this overall raid, just as were the supposedly sophisticated Russian air and ballistic missile defense systems in Iran knocked out by Israeli F-35s provided by the United States.
Yeah, there was quite an amusing clip of Pete Hegseth discussing this. I think at a veterans convention, he was mocking the Russian air defense systems. But it does lead me to China and the Russian relationship. I'm very obviously skeptical of just how far this goes. It's more strategic convenience, marriage of convenience. What do you think the Chinese are thinking right now in the context of the war in Ukraine, but also what's happened in Venezuela? I never want to underestimate what the CCP is capable of or thinking, but I'm curious how you see that dimension.
Well, the Chinese relationship with Russia has always been highly transactional. They don't see the Russian Federation as in the least bit uh, comparable to what they have in China, and I think that's an accurate assessment. That said, they don't want Russia to lose the war. I believe President Xi has said that explicitly publicly. And they are the biggest enabler of the military industrial complex of Russia. They're the ones providing the wherewithal. Remember, in the early days of the war, the full-blown war, Russia was buying huge numbers of refrigerators and then stripping them for their chips and other elements that were useful in the Russian military industrial complex. China is now providing all of that, the magnets that are required, the chips, all of the components necessary to manufacture hardware and software and so forth, and munitions. But again, that's because it's in their interest to prolong this war now. Remember, they were originally irritated by Russia's action because they were trying to develop a larger economic relationship with Ukraine, which, keep in mind, was exporting some 20 or 25% of the world's grain exports, not all production, but the exports. So again, it's a complicated relationship. China has learned from the Soviet Union. Their lesson is don't go soft like Gorbachev did. And they're certainly trying to learn from what's going on the battlefield. They may be doing that more assiduously than our NATO countries. I think they have a very wary eye as they see U.S. capabilities demonstrated, for example, in Caracas. No other military in the world could remotely have done that. Not, by the way, I think it was a much dicier operation than people seem to
Really?
realize. If you look, imagine the gunfights that took place, uh, given that there were over 30 Cuban special operations forces augmenting the Secret Service of Venezuela, and I don't know how many Venezuelans had to be taken out. But there was some serious military action here, vastly more challenging than the operation to get Osama bin Laden, as important strategically and as challenging in some individual cases, not to mention uh, the hard landing of the first aircraft, which meant that it couldn't be flown out. By the way, the lead helicopter was hit in this case. It's a very large MH-47 Chinook configured for special ops. And the lead pilot, was hit several times in the leg. And they had to, I'm sure there was awareness of this by those monitoring the operation, having monitored a few in my life in Iraq and Afghanistan, Central Command and CIA. And yet he stuck the landing and they managed to fly that aircraft out back to the appropriate location. Um, Look, China looks at that and it realizes what we have, notwithstanding their enormous increase in shipbuilding, autonomous system development, a host of other capabilities. But also, let's recognize they keep firing all their senior military. How do you have the confidence in your senior leaders if you have to fire them as regularly as President Xi has been doing? In any event, this stuff is complex. I don't buy the spheres of responsibility or what have you at all. I think the U.S. is active around the world. I think it actually is not a surprise that President Trump has not proved to be the isolationist that some of the campaign supporters and even perhaps campaign remarks might have indicated.
No, certainly not. I think anyone who thought he was an isolationist didn't understand what Trump really represents. But I guess my penultimate question for you, General, is simply there's a lot of emphasis on China's military capabilities. I think since President Xi Jinping took over with this whole wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's called in the West. But what is their specific capabilities? Because there's a lot of skepticism over their naval assets. Yes, they have aggregately more ships now, battleships, than the US, but
Not more battleships. I don't think anybody has any battleships anymore.
sorry, well,
They have a few aircraft carriers that are building into task forces and so forth. But again, no, they have a very substantially greater military capacity than they had before, and in some categories, it is greater than what the United States has. I would point out that they have had no recent combat experience. In fact, when Chinese leaders would come to Washington back when there were regular exchanges, and I was the director of the CIA, I was often asked if I would allow them to come out and meet with me. And I always said yes, in part because at some point in our conversation, I would note now, as you all know, generals, I, of course, had 5 combat commands just as a general officer alone. Uh, Many of you had combat experience. Oh, maybe. Oh, I guess not. Because, of course, the last real combat experience any of them had would have been in that particular war after our departure in the late 1970s. And there's really been nothing all that significant since then. So, yes, they've built impressive forces. They've realigned their command and control structure to rationalize that to more of what we have in terms of regional combatant commands and joint forces and so forth. By the way, in certain categories of advanced technology, they're ahead of us. We have better AI, they have more applications, and you can go back and forth all the way along on all this. They have the stack. We're betting on this, they're betting on that. But at the end of the day, if you have not actually been in combat and really exercised, even if it's against less than peer competitors, I think that's a major disadvantage. And our forces have had enormous experience, and all of our mid-level and senior level commissioned and non-commissioned officers have had extensive time in combat.
So I was thinking of the word dreadnought, shows you my knowledge when it comes to maritime military matters, General. But my last question for you is, you've discussed a little bit, you touched upon about the potency, but what's the propensity for there to be potential engagement between America and China over Taiwan? I mean, it's the classic end game question, but do you really think that's possible? I think it is conceivable given Xi Jinping's desire for national rejuvenation and the window that is closing. Most people point to 2027 or possibly 28. What would you share with the viewers about this element and whether Taiwan is?
Well, you've already answered the question. I
Oh,
think it's
sorry.
conceivable, obviously. Many things are conceivable. I don't know how likely it is. And frankly, let's remember that we get a vote big time. And that is if our capabilities are seen as substantial and impressive, and if our willingness to employ those capabilities is solid, not needlessly provocative. But again, these are the elements of deterrence, the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. And we have agency here. We can make decisions, and we are, although I'd argue that we need to accelerate the application of the decisions when it comes to transforming our capabilities, in part in view of lessons we should be learning from the war in Ukraine, and then also ensuring that there's no question of our willingness to use our forces if necessary, but that we do not want to be needlessly provocative. If we do that right, I think the likelihood is very low. If we don't, then I think it opens the question up a good bit more. But I'm hopeful, actually. And, one of the values of unconventional leaders, and certainly President Trump is that, as is Secretary Hegseth, is they're willing to take actions that others would not have taken. And one of those needs to be to blow up our military procurement system and start over, to recognize that the military industrial congressional complex, as Senator McCain used to describe it pejoratively, not fondly, is that there are vested interests in existing platforms and capabilities and weapon systems, existing basing arrangements, existing maintenance contracts, all of this, that all the individuals in these different complexes, military, industrial, congressional, will say, yes, we need to change procurement, but don't start with the platform made in my district. Don't start with the aircraft carrier task force in my based in my district. Don't do this, don't do that. And I think there's got to be some really aggressive action in this regard to overhaul the overall system and ideally to drive it with the basic concepts developed by the Indo-Pacific commander and his subordinate commanders that then are operationalized in a variety of different ways, most important of which would be those that establish requirements that then guide procurement.
And if I can tag on a cheeky little bonus question, General, with all that in mind, though, do you not think that the biggest strategic advantage asset the United States has is its alliance network? China has what, two or three bases around the world, couple defense packs, with one of them the Solomon Islands. America has 800 plus bases, which are crucial, as we saw with its acquisition of the tanker just a week ago. Do you
Oh,
not
I
think?
couldn't agree more. Look, I think Churchill had it right on this, as he did on so many other issues, um, including, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried all the other things. But on alliances, he observed that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. I very strongly subscribe to the value of alliances, however frustrating some of our allies may be, however disappointing one may be in their lack of completely doing what we'd like them to do. But I commanded two of the biggest wartime alliances in history, actual coalitions. Afghanistan was the largest, I believe, in history in terms of countries actually fighting. So it's
Was
smaller than the counter ISIS alliance or coalition, but we had many more countries actually engaged in fighting, over 60, as I recall. And I firmly embrace Churchill's notion about the importance of allies. And it is a unique uh, capability, a unique feature of the US overall power, if you will, around the world.
And as a Brit, I'm very delighted that you not only quote Churchill, but also, as you said, frustrating partners. I can only imagine that's the French. But joking aside, General, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I do hope we can do this again in the near
Merci
future.
beaucoup.
Merci.
A pleasure. Thanks. Good to be with you.
Bye-bye. Take care.